Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Kathryn, and I am here with my colleagues Kayli, Ben, Jasmine, and Jameson to present to you our policy lab on how urban mobility in Canada may be impacted by the integration of connected and autonomous vehicles into public transit system. We were tasked with developing a suite of policy recommendations for Infrastructure Canada, as well as to outline the roles and responsibilities of municipal, provincial, and federal governments, with a more in-depth look at the division of responsibilities among federal government departments that situates Infrastructure Canada's role within the overall policy landscape. As we worked on this policy brief, 4 overarching objectives came through that will be required to maximize the benefits of CAV integration into public transit systems. 1, increase public access to mobility. 2, support public transit systems. 3, reduce congestion. And 4, promote collaboration and provide federal guidance. These objectives guided our work and analysis on the potential impacts on public transit systems, cities, vulnerable populations, the environment, and the economy. The research for this report was done through a literature review, as well as a series of interviews. The literature review included peer-reviewed journal articles, parliamentary reports, and reports produced by industry associations, technical organizations, and other stakeholders. We also conducted a number of interviews with Infrastructure Canada, as well as with stakeholders at the provincial and municipal level. There's so much opportunity in the CAV field, and Infrastructure Canada is well positioned to make significant contributions to projects and initiatives that will utilize this technology to transform urban mobility in Canada. I will now pass it off to my colleague Ben, who will provide an overview of connected and autonomous vehicles.
Thank you, Kathryn. So imagine it's 8 a.m. and your alarm clock didn't wake you up. You have an hour until you're due to give a big presentation. The kids need to be dropped off at school. They have a big soccer game later that they have to get to, but you're not worried. You get dressed quickly and wave goodbye to the kids as they get into their pods, which link up with other pods carrying kids to school. You check your phone to see if the next public transit pod is available, and sure enough, it's at your front door. You hop into the self-driving vehicle, coffee in hand, flipping through your presentation and perfecting the brief one final time. You turn on some music. There's no need to look up the traffic report. They stopped doing those a while ago. If there's an accident, bad weather, or traffic up ahead, your vehicle already knows and will readjust its route to one that will get you there fastest. After your presentation, you and your coworkers head out for lunch in the courtyard near the museum. You remember when this area was nothing but a parking lot and realize there are a lot more businesses and parks than there used to be around here. Later that evening, a self-driving car picks you up and takes you to the soccer game, as it did for your kids. You happen to get into the same one as your parents, who can now travel on their own despite not driving for years. Afterwards, you all head home for dinner, which a self-driving taxi picked up for you. This may sound a little fantastic, and experts disagree about how soon the technology of connected and autonomous vehicles, or CAVs, will advance to the degree that I've described. This future is unclear, but rest assured it is already being built. CAVs will have a profound effect on our societies, not just on how we travel, but how we use our time and the way we design our cities. The success of how we adapt will depend on how technology advances, how the public and markets react, and how policymakers craft regulations. What sorts of effects will CAVs have on public transit systems, and how should the federal government prepare? This will be our journey this morning. But first, what exactly is a connected and/or autonomous vehicle? Seen here, connected vehicles use various wireless technologies to communicate with their surroundings. Automated vehicles utilize sensors and computer analytics to monitor their environments and perform tasks which to various degrees are independent of a human driver. The types of connectivity and automation vary within vehicles, and most new vehicles sold today actually contain some forms of each. But as technology advances towards greater connectivity and full automation, new federal regulations on safety will be needed during the transitional period, where CAVs inhabit the same transit system as traditional vehicles. Existing safety standards, for instance, do not yet apply to fully automated vehicles and will require cooperation from all levels of government to create safety regulations, particularly for public transit. The kind of future we can expect will largely depend on how society adopts CAVs. So what might this look like? Well, it may result in more use of public transit and ride sharing, reducing congestion, emissions, and accidents. Less road congestion means less need for parking and less road space, so more urban space could be opened up for development. Less fuel consumption means greener cities. The network may also connect more parts of the city to one another and even extend beyond city limits, increasing regional connectivity. This is referred to as CAV heaven. More people may buy more private vehicles, which will lead to more emissions and congestion with people living far from their work and essential services. Public transit would decline, resulting in decreased investment returns for cities and decreased relevance for public transit networks. We call this scenario CAV hell. Achieving CAV heaven and avoiding CAV hell is a key basis for our recommendations here today. But first, I will now turn to my colleague Jameson, who will give you a further background on the technology's potential impact on public transit.
Great. Thanks, Ben. While the impacts on public transit are expected to be profound, they will not immediately be realized, as public transit systems will incorporate advanced levels of automation and connectivity gradually. The trend has already begun here in Canada. In 2016, Vancouver's SkyTrain service became the world's longest fully automated driverless system. Future CAV use in public transit, however, will be very different. If safety standards are reached, public transit can extend beyond rail lines or exclusive lanes. Instead, CAVs have the potential to travel much like a personal car, which means CAVs have the ability to tackle what transit experts consider the first and last mile problem. With the current cost of operating and constructing public transit systems and the rigidity of routes, public transit seldom provides door-to-door service currently. The first and last mile problem means commuters are forced to drive or walk to access the starting point of public transit services. This inconvenience deters public transit ridership and moves people to utilize private travel, adding to congestion. Because CAV technologies are being developed to have the same flexibility as traditional cars, they have the potential of front door pickup and curbside office drop-off, eliminating first and last mile problems. However, should CAV fleets replace high volume routes like subway lines, costly investments would become obsolete and congestion could worsen. Instead, public transit should embrace a multimodal approach when incorporating CAVs. Multimodal transit is when more than one method of travel is required as part of a commute and has been embraced by transit systems for decades, as buses, subways, and streetcars are all often part of one network. Experts we interviewed often suggested that instead of replacing high volume lines, CAVs should run where there is no existing service and feed into established public transit. This could be a cost-effective alternative to the low volume routes, which currently circle in off-peak hours with little ridership and instead would only run when demanded. The problem with multimodal transit, however, rests in inconvenient wait times and transition between different modes of travel. To combat this issue and individual car use, public transit advocates hope for strong developments in mobility as a service, also known as MaaS. MaaS platforms seek to connect all different modes of travel into one synchronized system so that commuters can be guided through their entire travel, knowing wait times are minimized and the additional inconvenience of harmonized payments is available. MaaS systems can be made stronger with connectivity between vehicles, infrastructure, and cloud systems. Strong MaaS connectivity means knowing exactly when vehicles will arrive, that stop times at traffic lights are minimal, collisions and construction delays are avoided, together making the commute, even with transfers, far more time efficient and convenient. While all this sounds great, the transition to connected and autonomous public transit is not without real concerns. The first concern is the obvious challenge of getting the technology where it needs to be considered safe and trusted. The second is that considerable negative labor disruption is to be expected. Transit employees like bus drivers and payee attendants are all expected to be replaced by automated systems. This may have negative consequences on the social acceptability of public transit. Finally, there is real momentum in the private sector that public transit systems must catch up with or compete with. Companies like Uber have both the experience in providing customized door-to-door travel and the investment dollars that are being put towards CAV research and development. Together, this is positioning them for a strong performance in the shared CAV services arena. This may result in inequitable services being provided, as low-income communities will be left using traditional and less convenient transit options. Similarly, as public transit serves as the bedrock of strong communities and cities, many would be left out of conversations of providing feedback, as private companies will only want to appease clients. Thus, CAVs can strengthen public transit systems, but the barriers and threats to adoption must be considered. I'm now going to pass it off to Jasmine, who's going to shed some light on how CAVs will impact urban spaces.
Thank you, Jameson. Now that we understand the implications for public transit systems, I will now turn the discussion on impact for cities. As CAVs will change Canadian cities, the way individuals commute will be transformed and may lead to new trends in urban planning. That said, different deployment scenarios would lead to two land use outcomes: greater urban sprawl or greater densification. Urban planners will have to be prepared to address the pros and cons associated with these scenarios, and there will be a need for studies on the impact of CAVs on urban spaces to make informed policy choices that will best suit their communities. Now, as the public transit CAV systems lead to increased use of public transit, this will reduce the number of privately owned vehicles and reduce the need for parking in urban centers. If we imagine an ideal autonomous world, CAVs would drop passengers off and return home to the passenger's residence, where the vehicle will remain parked until pickup time, thus reducing the demand for parking. I would now like to turn the discussion on implications for infrastructure. As mentioned by my colleague Ben regarding contentions among experts on CAV deployment, there are varying opinions as well on the degree to which infrastructure changes will be initially required. Recognizing the role that Infrastructure Canada plays in creating stronger networks and physical infrastructure, more emphasis could be placed on vehicle-to-infrastructure technology, like sensors and mapping systems. The development of this infrastructure will be important for managing mixed traffic as well as collecting data that can be analyzed to support long-term improvements. Now, how do we imagine CAVs on Canadian winter roads? We all very well know about the severity of the winter weather, which presents significant challenges for CAV infrastructure technology. And so extensive safety testing will be necessary prior to deployment. Having implications for public transit and cities, CAVs also pose impacts on vulnerable communities, including persons with disabilities, seniors, and low-income communities. Presently, many urban transit systems in Canada are not within reach, which makes it difficult for them to access to services and employment. CAVs have the potential to address this lack of accessibility by enabling increased public transit through door-to-door shuttles, especially for seniors living within varying proximity to these essential services. Regarding environmental concerns, if public transit networks adapt CAVs utilizing low emissions technology, there may be a reduction of emissions. While CAVs create better efficiency, they may produce challenges in terms of waste production, which have to be dealt with. But overall, CAVs have the potential to offer environmental benefits. Now, moving on to the impacts on the economy, the development of CAV technologies provides an opportunity for Canadian businesses to lead internationally. Canadian innovation in the public transit field will provide Canada the ability to export CAV technologies abroad. In recognition of this potential, federal and provincial governments are supporting the industry through funding organizations like Propulsion Quebec and Autonomous Vehicle Innovation Network Ontario to foster the technological advancements in CAVs. Turning to the implications for labor, approximately 1.1 million jobs could be at stake with the adoption of CAVs. This would impact employees like bus and taxi drivers, traffic and police wardens. The motor vehicle manufacturing industry might also suffer due to decreased demand for personal vehicles. This requires attention from all levels of government to prepare to lessen the impacts of CAVs on job losses. For this reason, we have created a jurisdictional dashboard to understand the responsibilities and concerns for each level of government. That said, I will now turn to my colleague Ben for discussion on the municipal government's concerns.
Thank you, Jasmine. First, cities will need to consider the impact CAVs will have on sidewalks, parking lots, and roads. To best prepare, a city should consider removing parking quotas and broaden the scope of urban planning to include space that's currently allocated to personal vehicles, like parking lots and curb space. To adopt CAV technology into public transit, cities will need to design a network of drop-off and pickup spots to account for CAVs during peak congestion periods. And so the system must be well-timed. Cities also need to ensure that there are minimal barriers for the elderly, low-income groups, and other vulnerable communities. This could include things like paying in cash for low-income people that don't have internet access or credit. It's estimated that about 1 million people in Canada's 8 largest cities are currently underserved by their municipal transit system. CAVs can provide public transit options that operate at lower costs. CAVs can also better connect suburban areas to the downtown core and even better connect rural areas with one another and to cities close by. Cities should invest in public transit models that address gaps in existing fixed route designs and coordinate with other municipalities on extending existing transit lines to suburban and, where feasible, rural areas. Emergency response vehicles, ambulances, and fire trucks may also be converted to CAVs at some point in the future, with guiding systems enhancing their ability to provide services faster. Police services will have to adjust to CAVs as they will have a more limited role. With less violations, cities may collect less revenue from fines, impacting budgets, particularly for small urban areas that depend on such fines. Cities should also develop mobility as a service technology to improve the reliability of connected applications. Finally, light rail and subways may face competition from the private sector to compete with public transit networks as they provide more direct service. Therefore, municipalities must conceive of first mile, last mile solutions and mobility as a service platforms as a way to encourage people to use public transit. I now turn it over to my colleague Kayli for a discussion on provincial and federal stakeholders.
Thank you, Ben. Much like municipal governments, there are a series of responsibilities and concerns shared by provinces and territories. PTs are responsible for creating the legislative framework for CAV testing and road use and overseeing the trials of CAVs within their jurisdictions. Several provinces have already proposed or passed legislation to allow CAVs on public roads. This map illustrates where projects are currently taking place in Canada. PTs are also responsible for driver's licensing, vehicle registration, and insurance. CAVs will present new challenges for administering collision insurance, as well as insurance for important infrastructure that will be required for the deployment of this technology. Provinces and territories will also be responsible for the planning, developing, and budgeting of CAV infrastructure that will be required. Finally, PTs are responsible for ensuring public awareness of ongoing CAV testing and integration onto public roads, while also monitoring the organizations conducting trials. The primary concern of PTs will be to harmonize provincial and municipal policies, as CAVs will likely travel within numerous municipalities. PTs will want to ensure that CAVs can navigate through major metropolitan areas with relative ease. They will also be concerned with the safety and policing of CAVs and will want to be prepared to protect Canadians within their jurisdictions. An additional concern of provincial and territorial governments, similar to their federal and municipal counterparts, will of course be the employment disruptions caused by CAV integration. These job losses of transit operators and drivers, as well as automobile manufacturing, are of great concern. This could be a great concern to provinces that have large manufacturing sectors that could be disrupted by this technology, such as the province of Ontario. But as my colleague mentioned earlier, there is perhaps opportunity for the manufacturing of new technology needed for CAVs to replace the job losses in these sectors. Finally, provinces will be concerned about their ability to retain their autonomy. In the new realm of technology, direction and leadership from the federal government may be welcome, but overall, PTs will seek to maintain autonomy and decision-making power in their own jurisdictions. Despite a strong desire from provinces to retain their autonomy where possible, there will be a need for strong leadership from the federal government to ensure collaboration and coordination of policies. So who will lead this work at the federal level? Currently, Transport Canada and Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, ISED, are the departmental leads on CAVs. Transport is responsible for the safety standards of vehicles, including public transit bus fleets. According to Canada's Safety Framework for Automated and Connected Vehicles, the introduction of connected and autonomous vehicles has and will continue to require changes to existing legislation, which will be led by Transport. ISED is responsible for the allocation of radio frequency spectrum in Canada, which will be necessary for the deployment of CAVs. ISED is also responsible for the issuing of developmental licenses for the experimentation of these vehicles. In addition, ISED sets and enforces the compliance of technical standards in Canada, which will be important for the adoption, as well as they promote innovation in Canada through targeted funding. While Transport and ISED are the leads on the file, various other departments will be involved in the integration process. This includes Public Safety Canada, who will be responsible for managing cybersecurity concerns, Economic and Social Development Canada, who will be responsible for responding to the labor disruptions caused by the technology, Natural Resources Canada, who's currently the government lead on electric vehicles and is uniquely positioned to support Transport Canada and ISET through the integration process. The final government department is, of course, Infrastructure Canada, who has the important responsibility of funding public transit infrastructure projects. The integration of CAVs into public transit systems will require the guidance of Infrastructure Canada, who could be an important leader in understanding the infrastructure needs for CAV integration. Infrastructure Canada is well positioned to be a leader, given their administration of the Research and Knowledge Initiative. The initiative supports research knowledge sharing, collaborations, and partnerships to deepen understanding of infrastructure needs, challenges, and opportunities relevant to Canadians. Infrastructure has a unique opportunity to focus the initiative on infrastructure needed for CAV integration. In addition to the important responsibilities of government, integration, and similar to other jurisdictions, the federal government has a series of primary concerns that will need to be addressed when CAVs become a greater reality. These concerns include the social acceptability of the technology and, of course, the environment. The recommendations we will put forth seek to address the concerns of all levels of government and speak particularly to the opportunity infrastructure has to be a leader on this file. My colleagues Kathryn and Jameson will now walk us through our recommendations.
Thank you, Kayli. Our recommendations have been organized into 3 categories: research and development, increasing collaboration, and improving CAV safety. We will begin with research and development, which we have identified as an area with a major role for Infrastructure Canada to play. Their existing research and knowledge initiative could be used as a funding source through the development of contribution agreements to support research, knowledge sharing, and project development. Recommendation number 1 is the creation of a CAV Transit Challenge. This challenge could be modeled after the existing Smart Cities Challenge run by Infrastructure Canada as an opportunity for merit-based funding to effectively target innovative projects. This could further strengthen the department's relationship with municipalities and share ideas with other regions. A key feature of this challenge would be having multiple levels of funding. This would ensure that communities with differing capacity have an opportunity to access funding and create opportunities for small and medium-sized cities. A SMART program structure can support infrastructure's goals of encouraging projects involving first mile, last mile solutions and those directly addressing the needs of vulnerable populations. The second recommendation is to further research mobility pricing. A mobility pricing structure could potentially support public transit systems. There are a variety of mobility pricing structures that have been introduced in jurisdictions, and further research will be required to determine what the best fit would be in each Canadian city. Mobility pricing could encourage the use of public transit as well as reduce congestion and reduce environmental and economic impacts. Recommendation 3 is to develop first mile, last mile solutions through a 3-pronged approach that includes researching how mobility as a service can complement and be integrated into public transit systems, the potential impacts on ridership in urban centers, particularly for vulnerable populations, and how a program similar to the Climate Lens that prioritizes funding projects that service marginalized and underserved communities could be implemented. The development of first mile, last mile solutions is important to improve urban mobility within communities and to fill existing transit gaps. The 4th recommendation in this section is supporting urban space studies. This could be done to better understand the challenges of incorporating CAVs into existing urban spaces. The focus would be to understand the potentially large-scale redesign of urban centers that might be required as increasingly automated vehicles are on the road, as well as what type of infrastructure will be required to support them. Our second set of recommendations focuses on collaboration. Collaboration between government and industry will be critical for the development and implementation of CAVs into public transit systems. Recommendation number 5 is stakeholder collaboration. Infrastructure Canada could increase their role in promoting stakeholder collaboration in 2 ways. 1, they could partner with other federal government departments to establish a CAV forum that includes representatives from provincial and municipal governments. This could provide an opportunity for participants to share insights and perspectives on standards, regulations, and overall best practices. They could also establish a second forum that invites non-governmental actors to participate in this dialogue and provide them with opportunities for potential collaboration, as well as to provide insights to government policymakers. This forum could potentially lead to the creation of an industrial supercluster for CAVs in the future. As outlined in our jurisdictional dashboard, the CAV policy landscape is very complex, and no single actor can unilaterally control it. Therefore, it will be important to have continual conversation and engagement to promote harmonization of policies where possible, as well as to promote agility and adaptability based on the needs identified by industry stakeholders, so that there can be a balance between providing overall guidance and not limiting innovation. Recommendation number 6 is social acceptability. Infrastructure Canada could help promote social acceptability and awareness of CAV technology through public education initiatives. This could play an important role in educating Canadians about the opportunities and unique challenges of CAVs and public transit. Increasing social acceptability will be essential for the long-term feasibility of CAV technology. Although all CAVs will undergo extensive testing before being deployed on roads, it will be important that this is communicated effectively to the public so that they feel confident that they are safe riding these vehicles. It will also be important to increase social acceptability to encourage people to become long-term riders and not simply riding short-term as a novelty. My colleague Jameson will now share our final set of recommendations.
Great, thank you. I hope it is clear by now that CAVs have the potential to revolutionize public transit. If the technology is harnessed correctly, collisions and accidents will be greatly reduced, and Canadian roads will be safer for everyone. Perfecting CAV technology to ensure its full potential will require updating safety and testing standards. For that reason, the following 2 recommendations are being made. The first, in partnership with other federal government departments, Infrastructure Canada could work to establish safety standards for public transit CAVs. This will help provide guidance to policymakers and private sector manufacturers needed for them to plan and implement accordingly. Additionally, it will help boost the confidence of future users that the vehicles are safe enough for widespread use. Our final recommendation is that Infrastructure Canada could work with Transport Canada to help improve testing abilities for public transit CAVs and complementary smart infrastructure. This would mean exploring opportunities to make improvements to the federal government's Motor Vehicle Testing Center, which all vehicles must be tested at before being used on public roads. Similarly, Infrastructure Canada can explore ways to support other technology testing centers that help strengthen technology components that can later be incorporated into vehicles and infrastructure. I'm now going to pass it off to Kayli for some closing remarks.
Thank you. In conclusion, the recommendations we have put forward detail a path forward for Infrastructure Canada to be a leader on CAV integration in public transit systems. Avoiding a CAV hell and achieving heaven will require policy responses that maximize the benefits of CAVs without promoting the use of privately owned vehicles. A fully connected autonomous future may be hard to imagine for some, but that is our future reality, and it is never too early for governments to be prepared. CAVs provide a unique opportunity to reimagine and create a world that is more environmentally friendly and inclusive to all. CAVs will remove barriers to accessibility for many of our vulnerable communities. Nobody in our society should be left behind because they face barriers to accessing public transit. Better access to public transit will help increase the employment opportunities for many people who have faced barriers that could easily be addressed through public policy. CAVs provide us with a unique opportunity to remedy these wrongs and improve their access to public transit systems. Striving to reduce congestion, supporting public transit, promoting collaboration, and increasing public access to mobility will ensure a greener and more inclusive world. These are reasonable outcomes, and we believe our recommendations can help all governments achieve them. The important role public transit plays in our society positions Infrastructure Canada to be an important leader on the CAV file. We would like to thank everyone for attending our presentation. We hope we have made you excited about the prospect of a greener and more inclusive world. We would like to thank our sponsors at Infrastructure Canada for proposing this important challenge. We'd also like to extend a huge thank you to our coach, Jeff Kelly, who has helped guide us through this process. We now welcome any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayli and team. That was so interesting and such a topic that is relevant for us today as we're looking at all of the massive investments in infrastructure and public transit systems as the technology is increasing as well. We are now going to begin the Q&A period. We're going to begin with your team coach that has been following you and supporting you for the last 6 months, Jeff Kelly. And then after Jeff, I think I saw on the participant list that Jeff McGill from Infrastructure Canada is also with us. So after Jeff number 1, we're going to go to Jeff number 2 for any questions. So Jeff Kelly, why don't you begin?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and congratulations to my team. It's always a challenge to go first, so you're the one who broke the ice this morning. Congratulations. But it allows your coach to say, it was by far the best presentation we've heard. So congratulations on that. One of the things that we've talked about throughout this project is, you know, North Americans have a lifelong romance with the car and individual transport. And one of the part of the scope of our challenge was, how do we continue to promote public transit? How do we get people out of their individual vehicles and into public transit, whether the pods that Ben talked about in his presentation at the beginning, or some other CAV, the first mile, last mile solutions that you've talked about. So I guess my question is, to what extent will we be able to do that with a carrot or with a stick? Is it the attractiveness of the new technology, or is it the stick of nasty mobility pricing and other things that'll convince? I'm already a convert, as you know. I no conflict of interest for me in this, because I've never had a driver's license, so I've always been a public transit guy. But for all of my neighbors who seem to enjoy driving to work, is it the carrot or the stick that will get us to CAV heaven and avoid taking us to CAV hell?
Yes, I can take this. Thanks so much, Jeff. It's a very good point you make, and I think it's we, as cities design the networks, they have to bear in mind that private vehicles are probably going to still be coexisting with public transit. What we've proposed here are a list of sort of levers where we could make public transit much more convenient. So, for example, we talked about first mile, last mile, connecting underserved parts of the city to existing trunk networks. Also, mobility as a service, which essentially we're talking about applications which can design routes that cater to you specifically. Also, something interesting to point out, which is worth thinking about, I think. People love their cars, and there's going to be added conveniences, particularly to CAV technology, for private vehicles. Something to consider, though. Everybody, people who own a cars, they're incredibly expensive to upkeep. You have to get fixed, to pumping gas, and think how often during the day you actually use that car. Get to work, go back from work, maybe run some errands. You're maybe talking about 2 hours a day, perhaps, but you own the car 24 hours a day. So 2 hours you're actually using it, and then the rest of the time it's sitting in a garage someplace. Would it not be better to simply either have a vehicle run errands for you, or to use an existing network utilizing, again, what I've said, first mile, last mile, and mobility as a service? It's worth considering as this technology advances.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Jeff. We're going to move to Jeff Mackey, who also followed you for the last 6 months and actually thought up this challenge almost a year ago when we first started talking about it. Jeff, could you open up your mic and let us know also if there's anybody else from Infrastructure Canada that is with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Scott Surfless, who's also on the transit team at Infrastructure Canada, is on the line with me as well. And I know that there's a lot of interest in this file from a number of people within the policy division at Infrastructure currently. I'd like to thank everybody for the presentation. It was really, really well put together. I think you took a really holistic view of a really complicated issue and came out with a very good product. So thank you for that. Apologies, there's a garbage truck going in front of my house right now. My question has to do with how inevitable are connected and autonomous vehicles, is this a force that the government needs to kind of jujitsu? You know, the CAVs are going to happen no matter what, and we need to figure out how to deal with them. Or is this something that the federal, without federal intervention, CAVs won't become a big influence in Canadian life, and the government needs to intervene to make sure that we can pull out those benefits? And then maybe as a follow-up question to that, I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the benefits of transit. You often, you talked a little bit about safety, a little bit about the environment. If you could talk about specifically where those benefits come from, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. I think there is a certain amount of inevitability in connected and autonomous vehicles because we can already see them on the roads today to a certain degree. So many cars that are available right now already have assisted parking or different levels of connectivity installed into them. So I think the manufacturers will continue to develop this technology and it will just become more present on the roads as each manufacturer strives to continually improve. I think there's an important role for government in the development of this to ensure that the technology is used for the overall public good and not simply for encouraging what we would call CAV hell, where everyone has an individual privately owned CAV, because that won't eliminate a lot of the problems that we want to address in terms of congestion and environmental impacts. In terms of the overall benefits of public transit, I think there is a big difference in convenience factor when people have access to public transit, and it will be about developing those systems so that people value them and they can be more connected to their own communities. There was a pilot project done in Montreal that connected a neighborhood with a local grocery store. So it's not simply going back and forth from work, it can really increase mobility for people to access essential services in their communities.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you, Jeff. We're going to be moving on to Chris Reagan next, the director of the Max Bell School, with his question. And Chris, before you begin, I just want to give a shout out to anybody else at INFC. If you have a question, this is your time to ask the question to the team. Just open up your mic and your video, and we will pass the mic over to you.
Thanks, Natalie.
So, Chris, go ahead.
Thank you, Natalie. Just before we start, I noticed that Brenda Eaton is in the audience. Brenda is the chair of the board of the Max Bell Foundation, which is a rather important foundation for this school. And she's also on the Max Bell Advisory Board. So thank you, Brenda, for being here. And I hope you're enjoying these presentations. I've got two questions. It won't surprise anybody that are about economics. Two questions. One is about employment and one is about money. So my question about employment, and it was mentioned, I think, by Jameson, by Jasmine, also by Kayli, is that there will be employment disruption. As we proceed down this path, assuming that we do proceed down this path, there will be employment disruption. So taxi drivers may lose their jobs, conventional bus drivers may lose their jobs, things like that. And my question is, should governments, whether they're municipal, provincial, or federal, should they see employment disruption of this type as a reason not to proceed? Or should they be thinking about employment disruption as a problem that can be addressed, but one that kind of needs, we need to kind of get beyond it? I guess that's my first question. And my second question is about money. Not much was said about money. A little bit on mobility pricing. And my question is there anything unusual, unconventional in the CAV discussion about financing? Should we be thinking about different types of financing than normal? I mean, we know how governments usually finance things, right? They levy taxes, they collect money, they then spend money. Is there something about this, this development, this path forward that suggests a more difficult, more complicated form of financing? Those are my two questions. Thank you. And great presentation. Thank you very much for it.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I think in terms of the idea...
Sorry, and I particularly liked the little car moving along the bottom.
So did we. In terms of employment disruption, there's a very interesting conversation to be had in regards to that. Whether or not the government should, seek this or see this as something that they should be afraid of or not is widely debated, and it's yet to be it's not settled. But something that's very unique about what Infrastructure Canada does in their, when investing in infrastructure programs, is that part of their contract to the provinces includes something called community employment benefits. And what that means is that when they employ or when they provide money to the provinces to do projects, they make a requirement that part of those projects need to look into job training when doing a project. So meaning that when they're doing it, they need to look at for opportunities of people that may be able to future contribute to that project as people that could later work in whatever the subsequent result of that project may be. And I think that is a very smart way for Infrastructure Canada to see disruption, but also to look for positive change to come within it. I'm going to pass it. I think somebody, yeah, Kayli?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I'll jump in for the second part of your question there, Chris, about the financing. So we didn't really come across anything in our research concerned about the financing, and I think mostly because there still remains a lot of debate about the infrastructure required for the integration of these technologies. There's a lot of debate that on one half, the camp says there'll be very little infrastructure requirements. It'll be as simple as putting a sensor on a light post. It's going to be very minimal. It's going to be very cost effective. And on the other hand, another camp says it's going to be really intensive. It's going to cause a whole bunch of disruptions. We're going to need massive infrastructure investments to be able to deploy it. So I think until that debate is settled, there really can't be a debate on the financing issue, because we're not even aware of how big the infrastructure will be to integrate this technology.
Thank you, Chris, for that question. We're going to move on to other members of the faculty. I know we have Jennifer Welsh and Ian, Will Straw that have questions. If there are other faculty members that are on the call that have questions, if you could turn on your video and your mic, and we will proceed to the questions. So Jennifer, you are up first.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much. It was super interesting. I don't know all of you. I know Ben well because he was in my class, but hello to the rest of you. So I come at this as someone who hasn't really studied this technology in this context, but I have looked at it in autonomous weapons. And so I had two questions. The first one's related to that. So if you think about, at least in the world that I operate, it feels like AI lags behind the other two big technologies we have, which are more computational or analytic capacity and communications. That we almost have right now dumb AI, still relatively dumb AI, even though we're all impressed by it, in lagging behind those other two. And so when I was thinking about this presentation, I was thinking about how, it's fine to have relatively dumb AI on the battlefield, where you can handle a certain amount of collateral damage, but not so much in an urban center. And so I guess my question is really relating to the one from the fellow at Infrastructure Canada about how inevitable you really see these as being. Given that the excitement around autonomous vehicles, I think, has actually declined a little bit. That's just my impression because of that. But the second question is more around this last discussion you were having about infrastructure, because you're assuming, I guess, that we're using the existing road network. And we already have very congested roads in cities. And so how will the addition of CAVs in the city, really be accommodated, and how will the disappointment that might come from increased congestion be managed in your transition plan? Because I would assume, listening to you, that we're going to have a period where road density is going to increase. And so I just wonder how you think about that in your planning or in your policy making scenarios.
Thank you. It's an interesting question that you mentioned there, and it's really like at the crux of where experts disagree, okay, and whether or not this technology is ready to be deployed, or whether or not we need to pause and wait. And it's that infrastructure piece itself, whether or not it should be dependent on smart infrastructure. So when we think about some of the people that we spoke to and the stakeholders, again, looking to the city of Montreal as an example, when they conducted their pilot this past summer, they had said that, yeah, to some degree, the functionality of the vehicle itself was able to do as needed. but they had felt that it would be so much safer should it be complemented with smart infrastructure. So when we're speaking to people, especially your CAV advocates that feel like it's ready, we could take to the roads right now. You have other people saying that, yes, it very well could be on the roads right now, but it's not going to be to the safe degree that consumers want, and that it should at this point if it's going to roll out. You only have one chance to really roll out a technology like this. And should people say, no, this is not safe, it's going to take a long time to build the trust of consumers again. So to answer your question really is that, yeah, smart infrastructure and technology and AI is a large component of this. And I think that's the gap that still needs to be fit until it could head to the roads. In terms of the second part of your question, I feel as though one of my colleagues is going to jump in.
Sure, I can jump in quickly. So in terms of the congestion issue, what you said is correct. We understand this technology to be used on existing roadways. So what we've offered in our recommendations actually is meant to be kind of done together in an effort to push people out of their vehicles and into public transit systems in the hope of reducing congestion. So that includes using, as Jeff puts it, the carrot and the stick. So using mobility pricing systems that are going to encourage people to choose away from their personal vehicles and into public transit, and at the same time making public transit more convenient for people through first mile, last mile options and alternatives. Additionally, through urban space planning, we think that if more cities move towards transit-oriented development and prioritize cyclists, pedestrians, and transit users, there's going to be a greater desire from those of privately owned vehicle users to move to public transit because the convenience option is just too hard to deny any further. So I think the solution is going to be multi-pronged. You're going to have multiple policy responses at the same time to encourage private use vehicles to decline in favor of public transit use. And we think CAVs have the potential to do that work because they can provide first mile, last mile alternatives to a lot of people who don't currently have them and hopefully get them out of their vehicles.
Thank you. We are now going to move on to Will Straw.
Hi, that was a fantastic presentation. As a transit nerd who also doesn't drive a car, I was interested in every part of it. I'm interested in how you think, because if autonomous transport is a concern, obviously, of the federal ministry or various federal ministries, of course, it's also been central to all kinds of smart city scenarios and planning and so on. And so between a kind of national federal policy level and the ongoing experimentation at the level of different cities where transit is linked with sort of all kinds of other things, how do you think these jurisdictional differences or levels are going to play out?
Sure, I'll hop in, team, and then someone can jump in if I miss anything. It's going to be very complicated. The jurisdictional boundaries are very complicated. Of course, the provinces are responsible for infrastructure or for public transit projects, and of course, the municipalities play a strong role in planning them and helping design them. So it's going to take all levels of government collaboration, which is why one section of our recommendations is to increase collaboration between all three levels to ensure that there are harmonization of policies and harmonization of technology. Nobody wants to ride their CAV to the border of Manitoba and not have it be able to go into the next jurisdiction. So it's going to be challenging, and we actually think that will be one of the biggest challenges is ensuring that all levels of government work together to get this done, but it absolutely will require all three levels of government.
Thank you.
I also want to add, in order for the successful implementation of CAVs, in addition to the collaboration between intra-departmental at federal level government, as well as between provincial, municipal, and federal, it's a high time that the government start involving the general public for the social acceptability, which is also an important factor, and especially for the indigenous communities living on the urban periphery to involve about their needs and priorities. And I think through the collaboration, the governments can come up with more inclusive policy options for the CAV options.
Thank you, Will and team. We're going to be moving on to Ian Peach for the next question. And if anybody else in the audience has any questions, please let me know in the chat or raise your hand.
Morning, folks. Great presentation, really interesting. Couple of thoughts came to mind I'd be interested in your reactions to. The first, the big one is you spoke about ensuring access for currently underserved populations. And I sort of went off on a bit of a tangent in my head on that, thinking about the incredible capital cost of putting this stuff in place. And, you know, I'm sitting in Fredericton. We have 65, 70,000 people. I can't imagine that we have a critical mass, even in this city, to get connected to connected autonomous vehicle network. Certainly, rural residents would have tremendous difficulty. Have you talked amongst yourselves about the regulatory and financial challenges of putting a network that does not reinforce the divide between the haves and have-nots within society in place? And the other thought I had was around the employment disruption question. It takes me back to the mock cabinet meeting. Cabinet meetings I had you all do, and the topic is long-term employment disruption of automation and AI reinforcing the argument for going to a base guaranteed annual income as a way to manage disruption. So, thoughts?
Yeah, I can hop in on this. And hello, Professor Peach. It's been a while. Hi.
Ian, not Professor Peach. No, I'm not teaching you anymore.
Formal. Graded. Come on. So the first part of your question, if I understood it properly, is there really a cost benefit, and can this really serve underserved communities? Did I get that correct?
Yeah. How do you widen out the benefit given the cost? So where does the cost benefit line come, and how do you adjust that?
Right. So there's a lot of the literature. It seems to be that there are a lot of operational costs that are saved by CAVs. Not just. I mean, yes, you brought up employment, and it's very context specific in the way that it's deployed. Some scenarios, cities do save money. Some scenarios actually, based on current models, I'm not going to say make a profit, because you don't make a profit by running a transit service, but it's far less expensive than it would be now. It's actually, and given mobility as a service in first mile, last mile, which is connecting previously underserviced parts to existing things. So I'm from Toronto. I'm thinking of areas of Toronto, both that are downtown, kind of in inner cities, that are, you know, you have to wait a half hour for a bus in the middle of the winter, and sometimes it usually doesn't even come for 45 minutes, an hour. This has happened a lot. I've personally actually taken a taxi cab to get to a subway line. But if you have an application where it can show up and where it can gear it and find the best routes, it can actually sort of spread the fingers of this transit system into stuff that a regular fixed bus service quite can't do. So I do think it is more convenient that way. As to your second question with UBI, so that's a worthy discussion. I think it's a little bit outside of purview, but I think there are all sorts of interesting reasons why you would discuss a UBI, and perhaps labor disruption is one of them. Although I should point out, a lot of services would get reallocated this way. So I mentioned earlier police services. There's a lot of traffic cops on the road, but there's been testimony saying that police services can just kind of reallocate their resources in some ways. There's also going to need to be attendance on CAVs to help people who may be elderly or otherwise require assistance. That you also have to run a communications network. So it does create jobs, but there's also some long-term losses as well.
Thank you, Benjamin. In the interest of time, we have a few minutes left and we have 3 questions pending. So I'm going to move over to INFC. I believe this might be Scott. I see S. Surfalis as the name.
Yes. Thanks so much, everyone. Really enjoyed that presentation. You guys did a tremendous job. I just have a very quick question just on as we navigate through thinking about future-proofing public transit in a post-COVID world where ridership has really declined and we've seen massive impacts on municipal finances. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on the potential for CAVs to bolster public transit or to act as a hedge against future shocks.
That is something that we thought about a lot, as there's been a complete reorientation of how people go about their days. Our response to that would be maybe the redesign of public transit to be more community-based. Instead of being focused on commuter networks, to focus the existing transit and new transit lines on how to better connect within communities. Although people may not be traveling to work, there still is a need for people to have mobility and to be able to access essential services. So that is where we think that the future of public transit may go, and just to be more community focused.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you, Scott. Taylor, if you could turn on your video and your sound, will be the next question. Taylor Owen, part of the faculty. Taylor, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry everyone. Yeah, we've seen from various failed.
Sorry, Taylor. The sound is cutting out. Team, did you hear him? Okay, Taylor, if you could write out your question in the chat and we'll move to Genoa next. Genoa, if you can turn on your mic and your video, please. Thank you.
Hey, so I was wondering, I guess one of the problems with public transit now is that people don't want to use it or they don't find it convenient. And even though it seems like having it being like automated is more convenient, is there a fear or I guess a limit, not really a limitation, that's not the right word, but that people just won't use it and therefore it'll be a huge investment in a system that isn't being used? And is there, like, I guess, is there ways to stop that from happening and make it more popular? Or yeah, I'm wondering how you think like the public perception of this will be in the future.
Sure, I can take that, Genoa. Thank you for your question. So essentially, social acceptability is going to be a huge hurdle, we believe, for this technology. A number of experts that we interviewed actually kind of equated it to the introduction of early automobiles, that they got to benefit from the fact of the non-social media world. So every time there's an accident with Google or Uber, it goes across the entire globe. Everybody hears about it. It makes people not trust this technology. In fact, a study done at Ryerson found that between a 2-year gap, social acceptability of CAVs decreased because of an accident that Google had that made the headlines. So social acceptability is going to be huge, a huge hurdle for all governments to overcome, but we think it's possible. We think through public awareness campaigns, we think through, changing your driver's licensing manuals, we think educating the public on what the technology actually does, how it services people, and how safe it is once it gets to a place where it's safe enough to be on the roads, is going to take a big effort, but we think it's possible, and we think that there are means available to governments to ensure social acceptability increases for the use of this technology.
Thank you, Kayli. So the last question comes from Taylor. I think his sound might be better. We have just a few seconds for you to answer the question. Taylor, do you want to go ahead?
make this comment too if that's better. But I mean, the one thing we've seen fail.
Sorry, the sound is not working. So let me give you the question. So let's see. So Taylor says, we've seen from Smart City Initiative in the past 5 years that their success is not an issue of technology, but of legitimacy and democratic process. How can we ensure that both are built into the design of these processes? Final question for the end.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that really complements what Jasmine had mentioned previously, the idea of how do we make a holistic democratic process about this? And it's, yes, we identified that municipal governments, federal governments, and the provinces have a massive role to play in all this. But it's also taken the time to hear from citizens as well, those within the city centers, as well as those immediately outside. Also, in terms of the private players that are at hand here, it's very interesting because they've got a lot of momentum behind them, as well as a lot of research and development dollars. So if you look at the way that institutions are trying to insert themselves on an international level into this conversation, a lot of the efforts are being done towards this idea of privacy, data sharing, to make sure that uniformly, no matter where the company is based, whether it be in the United States or Europe, there is some idea of harmonization and protection of citizens. And that's what a lot of the state level advocacy is going for right now.